Para empezar el día, vamos a volver a recibir a
To start the day off, we're going to receive Jason Pontin, the head editor of technology review, and he's going to tell you, give you some exclusive content. It's just been printed; it hasn't even been distributed in this month's magazine. We created for the first time a review called the 50 Most Disruptive Companies, and these are the companies that are going to change the sectors they operate in the most radical way.
Please welcome Mr. Jason Pontin, Editor-in-Chief and Publisher of Technology Review.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning. It's nice to see you here so early. Is my mic once again breathing hard? No. OK, there we go. So I'm going to take you through our top 50 companies, the smartest companies in the entire world. You are the first audience to have these companies presented to you. So a brief history of these companies. We have been choosing the 50 smartest companies in the world since 2010. As you can see, I've had some difficulty knowing what to call it. At first, we called it the most innovative companies in the world, but we already had a list called the 35 Young Innovators, who you've been seeing over the last couple of days. So we thought to call the companies the most disruptive companies in the world. But it turned out the companies really disliked being called disruptive, and no one bragged about it. They all refused to send out a press release. So this year we just gave up and decided to call them the smartest companies in the world. Why do we do it? Well, companies are important to the technology innovation system. Even though we were born inside a university, we fundamentally believe that invention is not innovation, that for an innovation to really take wing, it must make a business process better or create a new product or service that actually has value in the world. And we believe that entrepreneurs and large public companies are the principal driver of commercializing new technologies. How do we do it? The criterion for choosing a top 50 company is remarkably simple. We ask whether or not a company has commercialized a disruptive innovation during the last 12 months that has forced the rest of its domain, of its field, to play catch-up. So a possible example just from this last year has been Facebook's extraordinary move into the mobile space, which every other social networking company has had to keep pace with. So the 2014 list, here it is, the smartest companies in the world. The smartest company in the world is in fact not Google, though if you can see on that screen, it's number 3. I'm not going to give you all 50 companies, that's going to be too difficult, but I'm going to talk about 3 companies. Illumina, the smartest company in the entire world, Tesla, and a new startup called 1366. Before I leave the list, though, I think what's interesting about this list isn't just the companies who are on it, and they're all great, but who isn't on the list. So the company's about half private, half public, and if you can scan up there, I'll tell you a couple of companies you don't see there. Microsoft isn't there, and Apple isn't there. So why not? Well, Microsoft isn't there because Microsoft sucks these days. Microsoft isn't there because it has ceased to innovate in any meaningful way. Companies can still be profoundly important, generating billions of dollars in revenue a year. Companies can even be profoundly important platform companies. And for a while, they can continue to do business. But if they can't continue to disrupt their marketplace, then in the end, they tend to disappear. Some of the older gray heads in the room will remember companies like DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, which would have been impossible to imagine 20 years ago that DEC would no longer exist. And then Microsoft swept it out of importance, just as Google and other companies have swept Microsoft out of importance. It will be interesting to see whether Satya Nadella, the new CEO of Microsoft, can reform the Microsoft that had dominated enterprise computing for 25 years. The other company that's missing from the list, which I talked about, was Apple. So the late Steve Jobs once said to me that a company must either destroy itself in technology every 10 years or be destroyed. And Steve Jobs had that extraordinary capacity to be willing to eat his own favorite children. And this isn't a small or trivial thing in a CEO. And it's not even a rational thing in some ways. But Apple was willing to destruct billion-dollar businesses it had and replace them with new businesses. So Apple had a very nice business with the iPod. It dominated small music players. And now I never see anyone except people running wearing a small little iPod. Instead, Apple decided to commit to the iPhone. I'm not sure whether or not the new management at Apple has that same capacity, that same excitement about displacing existing lines of business with new innovations. So that's the list. I'm going to focus on 3 companies that completely wowed us. So let's begin with the first company. So let's talk about DNA sequencing. Even 10 years ago, to sequence an entire genome cost $100 million. And if you look back to the first genome ever sequenced, that of Watson, the inventor, the discoverer of DNA's structure, it cost, of course, $1 billion when the Human Genome Project was first completed. It wasn't just incredibly expensive, but it was time-consuming. It took months, if not years, and it was incredibly complex. You could not sequence the entire DNA of a human being in any way that was useful in the clinical setting of a hospital. So one company has changed all of that, and this is this company called Illumina. Illumina has driven down the cost of sequencing an entire DNA genome so that it can be done in hours, and it can be done at the critical price point of only $1,000. Illumina now is the Intel of DNA sequencing. It owns 70% of the marketplace, and it doesn't just own the machines that sequence DNA, it owns a whole number of consumer products as well. For instance, you can buy from Illumina a product that will sequence the entire genome of your fetus before it's born, and you can identify any genes that you might not want to bring to birth. Illumina is going to change everything. This is a multi-billion-dollar business. Soon we will be able to go into the hospital, they'll sequence our DNA in the hospital, and they'll match whatever genetic mutation we have to an actual therapy. And it's not just going to change the way medicine is practiced. It will create a whole new variety of therapeutics, but it's also going to present us with a variety of genetic information that we're going to struggle with as a species. Illumina is going to tell us things about ourselves that we may not want to know. We will find genetic correlations for impulse control, for anger. Perhaps some of the genetic correlates of intelligence will be discovered. And we will also find genetic correlates for things like autism. We don't really know what to do with information like this. So just to use the example as I was talking about, the example of prenatal DNA sequencing, parents will soon have to make choices about whether or not to bring a child into the world based on the statistical likelihood of that child having a disease. Last year, the actress Angelina Jolie had a radical mastectomy and hysterectomy because she had a gene called BRCA1 that meant she had an 80% chance of developing breast cancer in her life. Had Angelina Jolie been born today, her father, the actor Jon Voight, would have had to have made a decision based on the statistical likelihood that this fetus would have the gene and would die of a disease. I don't think we know how to think those decisions through yet. So Illumina is going to change everything in a very dramatic way. So here's the second company I wanted to talk to you about, Tesla Motors. So here's the problem. Transportation, one way or another, amounts to around 20% of global carbon emissions. 20%, and we would dearly love to have electric cars replacing the internal combustion engines that today make up the majority of automobiles and trucks. But so far, electric cars have had enormous difficulties in penetrating the marketplace. They've been too expensive, they haven't had a far enough range, and the batteries have had difficulties. The batteries have been difficult to dispose of, they've had their own pollution problems. They don't work for a variety of reasons. One company is completely changing that, and that's Tesla Motors, founded by Elon Musk and J.B. Straubel. Tesla is a different sort of company altogether, and it's why it's our second smartest company. It does some remarkable things. One of the remarkable things it does is that the companies can be fixed remotely by Tesla Motors itself. Last year, a couple of the cars exploded, worryingly, or at least caught fire on the roads because they were too close to the ground. Lithium-ion batteries can explode if knocked too heavily. So Tesla fixed it by sending out a software update that increased the elevation of all the cars it had sold. It did it remotely. Rather than having to recall them, they fixed it from headquarters. The other amazing thing that Tesla does is its batteries are remarkable in themselves. The GM Volt has a number of very large lithium-ion batteries. Instead, Tesla went the other direction. Tesla automobiles have around 10,000 batteries inside their cars. Small, efficient, lightweight. Tesla is an interesting company. So it entered the marketplace with a Roadster at around $100,000. The new car is still pretty expensive. It costs about $70,000. But sometime in the next couple of years, they intend to push into the marketplace a low-price sedan for $35,000. The technologies exist, and this new sedan will have a range of around 250 miles. So this, I think, is the future of electric cars. And of course, as you can see, they're also just physically gorgeous cars as well. So here's the last company I wanted to talk to you about today. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about the energy marketplace with John. We believe at Technology Review that probably the most scalable form of renewable energy is likely to be solar energy. But solar energy has a number of profound problems. Today, less than 2% of worldwide energy output comes from advanced renewable sources like solar. Less than 2%, and as I was saying yesterday, the reason is almost wholly cost. Petroleum, natural gas, and coal are all cheaper than solar energy production. The cost of natural gas in the United States at the moment is around 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And though sometimes solar energy in very sunny parts of the world approaches that, normally solar costs are around 30 to 80 cents a kilowatt hour. We want solar energy to be significantly cheaper. And there are not many obvious ways to make it cheaper. A lot of the cost of solar energy is found in its installation. There are other problems as well. There is significant waste during the production of these solar cells, and so far almost every startup like Solyndra or Bound Solar that has attempted to disrupt the cost of solar production has failed ignominiously. In the case of Solyndra, they went out of business having received almost $500 million in loan guarantees from the United States government. So there's a company coming out of MIT, a startup, it's very young, called 1366 Technologies. It was founded by a MIT professor called Eli Sachs, who left the company in order to devote his life to driving down the cost of solar energy to the point where it becomes cost competitive with natural gas. And 1366 it's an odd company. It doesn't try and do everything. It focuses on a single area of solar cell manufacturing, the direct wafer. So about 40% of the costs of solar technology are in the manufacturing. And what 1366 does is it manufactures the silicon wafer in a single process, and with just one step. And by doing that, it removes around 50 to 75% of the costs of solar cell manufacturing. And that is, in and of itself, enough to drive down the cost curve of solar, where it begins to become cost competitive with natural gas in most parts of the world where there's relatively continuous sunshine. I think in some ways companies like 1366 are the best hope for our children and our grandchildren who want to see a world where most energy is produced from carbon neutral means of production. It's going to take a lot. At the moment, 1366 has not yet proven it can make its manufacturing process work at scale. It has a $100 million pilot plant, which they have built in the suburbs of Boston. They need to show they can do this at a vast industrial scale before it will work, and that'll probably have to mean moving their production facilities out of the United States to China. But the hope is to, at first, drive down the cost to the point of coal, and then to drive it down even further to the cost of natural gas. I am wild about 1366. I urge you to look it up. And I urge you as well to go online and read our 50 companies and see which are the smartest companies in the world. And if you have a startup and you think you should have been on the list, write to me at jpontin@mit.edu and tell me why you're the smartest company in the world for 2015. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for a few questions.
Sure. Yeah.
So I was curious, Jason, about the process you use to select these companies.
Tea leaves. No, it's a very deliberative process. It's not purely quantitative. So we are interested in things like IP. We are interested in mergers and acquisitions. We're interested in market cap. But in the end, it's very difficult to judge a private company by those means. So often with private companies, all you have to look at is venture capital raised. So in the end, as I said, our principal criterion is, did they introduce to the marketplace an effective innovation in the last 12 months that had commercial scale and forced all their competitors to scurry to keep up to it? So was there a technically defined disruptive innovation, and then did they build on that innovation in a really smart way? So I'll give you an example of Illumina. Illumina invented almost none of the technologies I described. Their principal technology, which is called sequencing by synthesis, they bought from another company called Solyndra. But Solexa's technology didn't scale. and it had a number of problems with flexibility. Illumina took it and they made it into a commercial product. And when they bought it, it was a tiny marketplace. It was $2.5 million in revenue. And now they're earning billions of dollars from the sequencing technology. So did they disrupt, and did they disrupt smartly?
Now, coming back to that 10-year frame time lapse that you mentioned before about companies either killing their products or killing themselves.
Yes.
How many of these companies are less than 10 years old? Most of them are actually.
That's a good example. So we counted that. Around 75% of them are less than 10 years old. So that's really interesting. So there's, you can actually quantify this, and business professors have done so. The amount of time a company is on the US S&P list of traded companies is getting shorter and shorter. Mm-hmm. What's fascinating, though, is there are a few very big companies who have managed to stay on the list for a long time. And one of our favorites is General Electric. So General Electric is an extraordinary company. It actually dates back to Thomas Edison, the inventor of industrial-scale electricity generation. General Electric has remained innovative because it owns pilot plants. So it has labs, and then it has right next to the labs these pilot plants where they can see whether or not a new technology can scale to a commercial level. We're wild about General Electric, so it is possible for a 100-year-old company to remain competitive as well.
And my last question, now that we're outside the US, if we had done this study a few years ago, maybe most of the companies would have been based in San Francisco or founded in the area of Silicon Valley. How many of the companies are not founded in Silicon Valley, and how many of them are actually foreign companies? So
that's a good question. I'd have to count it, but it is by no means a US list this year. Just to go and give some examples, there are 5 Chinese companies on the list, 2 South Korean companies, an Israeli company, a lot of European companies. I'm sorry to say no South American companies this year, but perhaps next. Silicon Valley has ceased to be the driver of innovation, in my opinion, outside a few very narrow areas. Silicon Valley has become overwhelmingly focused on value to be derived from web startups and from social networking companies. They have diverted us and enriched themselves by doing things like Facebook, or yesterday's ridiculous acquisition of WhatsApp for $19 billion in cash and stock. WhatsApp is fine, it's great, but was it really worth 10% of the market cap of Facebook for what's essentially an instant messaging and photo sharing album? Instead, we're much more excited by companies like Celeria, or like Xiaomi, companies outside the United States that are seeking to solve really big problems and change the world in dramatic ways.
Okay, thank you, Jason. I think maybe this is a good message to end the panel.
Yeah, thank you.
And an important call to action. We would like to have a few South American companies in the list, right?
Get on the list next year. Pitch me and tell me why you're great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.